Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. Final scenic overlook before we head back to town. I always make the same announcement. All right, folks. Last chance for a picture of these beautiful mountains. It sounds friendly, but it's not for them. It's for whatever might have followed us down from the high peaks. The bright flash from all the cameras, it seems to drive them back into the trees. My boss told me on day one, make sure they take a lot of pictures. You don't want to bring any unseen passengers back to the depot with you. My name's Silas Buchanan, and I've been driving tour buses through these Tennessee mountains for 3 years now. Before that, I was fixing transmissions at Amos Whitaker's garage in downtown Gatlinburg, but the arthritis in my hands got too bad for wrench work. When Ezra Holcomb at Blue Ridge Mountain Tours offered me a job driving his tourist buses, I figured it beat unemployment. Pay was decent, $42,000 a year plus tips, and all I had to do was drive folks around the scenic routes, point out a few landmarks, and keep everybody happy. Ezra handed me a laminated card with 6 rules typed on it. Said they were company policy for driver safety. Most of them seemed like common sense. Check your mirrors every 30 seconds. Never exceed 25 miles per hour on the mountain roads. Always carry 2 emergency flares in the front compartment. But rule number 4 made me pause. Passengers report seeing people walking alongside the bus on remote stretches. Do not acknowledge these sightings. Redirect conversation to local wildlife or historical facts. Ezra caught my expression. Mountain folk around here got active imaginations, he said, scratching at his graying beard. Stress of the altitude, unfamiliar surroundings. You just keep them focused on the real attractions. I should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why a tour company needed rules about hallucinations. Should have noticed how Ezra's eyes kept darting to the tree line while he talked, like something might step out at any moment. My route covers the eastern section of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Found Gap, Cataract Falls, the old settlers' cabins near Elkmont. Pretty standard tourist stuff. Most days I get retirees from Florida or families from Atlanta wanting to see fall foliage. They climb aboard my 32-passenger bus at 9 a.m. sharp, and I bring them home by 4 p.m. The tourists love my stories about Cherokee settlements and bootleggers' caves. They take selfies at every stop, buy overpriced fudge in Gatlinburg, and leave 5-star reviews about their authentic mountain experience. What they don't know is that every trip, I'm counting passengers. Not just at the beginning and end, but constantly. Because sometimes, when we're winding through the remote backcountry near Mount LeConte, the count changes. Someone appears in a seat that was empty 20 minutes before. Someone who doesn't smell quite right, whose clothes seem older than they should be, whose presence makes the temperature drop 5 degrees. That's when the real rules kick in. My first week driving for Blue Ridge Mountain Tours, I thought the weirdest thing would be dealing with cranky tourists complaining about the winding roads. Boy, was I wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when I met Dottie Ramsey. She'd been driving these routes for Ezra longer than anyone. 15 years, she told me. Her weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of bus number 3, like she was holding on to life itself. We were both parked at the depot on River Road, waiting for our morning groups. "Silas, honey," she said, leaning out her driver window. "Ezra give you the rules yet?" I pulled out the laminated card. "Got 'em right here. Pretty straightforward stuff." Dottie's laugh came out harsh as sandpaper. Straightforward. Right. She glanced around the empty parking lot, then motioned me closer. "Listen careful now. That list you got? That's just the beginning. Real rules ain't written down anywhere. Before I could ask what she meant, a white van pulled into the lot. Today's tour group. 17 people from a church in Knoxville, here to see the changing leaves. Dottie straightened up, her whole demeanor shifting. "Remember what I said," she whispered, then drove off toward the Cades Cove route. The church folks were pleasant enough. Pastor Jenkins, a round man with kind eyes, helped an elderly woman named Mrs. Caldwell onto the bus. A young family with twin boys around 8 years old took seats near the front. Standard Tuesday morning crowd. I ran through my usual spiel as we pulled onto Highway 441. "Welcome aboard Blue Ridge Mountain Tours. I'm Silas, your driver and guide for today. We'll be heading up through Newfound Gap, stopping at Cataract Falls, finishing at the Chimney Tops overlook." The first hour went smoothly. I pointed out a black bear foraging near the roadside, told them about the CCC workers who built these roads in the 1930s. Mrs. Caldwell took pictures of everything, every deer, every historic marker, every scenic vista. We were climbing toward the gap when one of the twin boys, Tyler, pressed his face against the window. "Mom, look! There's a man walking up there." I glanced in my rearview mirror. The boy was pointing at the steep hillside to our left, where thick rhododendron bushes crowded between the trees. "Honey, I don't see anything," his mother said, but Tyler kept pointing. "He's wearing old clothes, like a farmer or something, and he's keeping up with the bus." My stomach dropped. I checked the odometer. We were doing 22 miles per hour up a steep grade. Nobody walks that fast uphill through dense brush. Rule number 4 echoed in my head. Its passengers report seeing people walking alongside the bus on remote stretches. Do not acknowledge these sightings. "Tyler," I called back cheerfully, "you know these mountains are home to over 60 species of mammals. Black bears, white-tailed deer, even some elk that were reintroduced in 2001. The boy looked confused. But the man... "Oh, you might be seeing shadows moving through the trees," I continued. "Mountain light can play tricks on your eyes. Creates all sorts of interesting shapes." Tyler's brother Mason joined him at the window. "I see him too. He's got a beard and he's carrying something long like a stick." Pastor Jenkins moved to their seats. "Boys, don't bother Mr. Silas with tall tales." But Mrs. Caldwell had turned in her seat, squinting at the hillside. "My word," she said quietly, "there is someone out there." I felt sweat beading on my forehead, despite the cool mountain air. 3 passengers now. All seemed the same thing. "Folks," I announced, "coming up on our right, you'll see Hallam Cave Creek. This waterway was crucial for early settlers who used the mineral deposits for tanning leather." I was rambling now, desperate to redirect their attention. But in my rearview mirror, I saw more heads turning toward the left side of the bus. Half the group was staring out those windows now. Pastor Jenkins came forward. "Silas, son, I think there really might be someone out there. Should we call park rangers? Man could be lost or injured." The radio crackled to life. Ezra's voice from the depot. "Bus number 4, what's your 20? I grabbed the handset with shaking fingers. "About 2 miles from Newfound Gap, heading north." "Copy that. How's your passenger count?" Strange question. 17, same as when we left." "Good. Keep it that way." The radio went silent. Pastor Jenkins gave me a puzzled look, but I pretended to focus on the road. Around the next curve, the hillside leveled out into a small meadow, and whatever the passengers had been seeing was gone. The tension in the bus eased slightly. We reached Cataract Falls without incident. Everyone climbed off to stretch their legs and take photos of the 30-foot cascade. I did my standard head count as they reboarded, 17. But as we pulled away from the parking area, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Someone was sitting in the back row, seat 14B, which had been empty all morning. My blood turned to ice water. I forced myself to count again, slower this time. 18. The figure in 14B wore old denim overalls, faded plaid shirt. His beard reached nearly to his chest, streaked with gray. Most disturbing of all, he was looking directly at me in the rearview mirror with eyes that seemed too pale, too knowing. I thought about Ezra's radio check. "Keep it that way," he'd said. "Keep the passenger count at 17. The man in 14B smiled at me, a cold expression that never reached those colorless eyes. I understood now why Dottie's hands never left her steering wheel. I had two choices: panic, and potentially get everyone killed on these narrow mountain roads, or pretend everything was normal while figuring out what to do about the man who shouldn't exist sitting in my bus. I chose option 2, though my hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. "The next stop coming up is the historic Elkmont District," I announced, my voice somehow steady. This area was once home to a logging community, then became a retreat for wealthy families from Knoxville and Chattanooga. In the rearview mirror, I watched the figure in 14B. He hadn't moved since appearing, just sat there with his hands folded in his lap, those pale eyes fixed on me. None of the other passengers seemed to notice him. Pastor Jenkins was pointing out wildflowers to the twin boys. Mrs. Caldwell was organizing her camera equipment. The young mother was helping her husband identify bird species in his field guide. The temperature on the bus had dropped noticeably. I could see my breath forming small puffs when I spoke. As we descended toward Elkmont, my radio crackled again. "Bus number 4. This is Dottie on bus number 3. You copy?" I grabbed the handset. "Copy, Dottie." "How are you doing over there, honey?" "Everything normal?" The way she emphasized that last word told me she knew exactly what was happening. "Well, it's been an interesting morning," I said carefully. "I bet it has. Listen, when you get to Elkmont, make sure everyone gets off for the full tour. Every single paying passenger. You understand?" "Copy that. And Silas, don't you dare look directly at seat 14B. Not until they're all off the bus." The radio went dead, leaving me with more questions than answers. But Dottie had been doing this for 15 years. If she said don't look, I wouldn't look. We pulled into the Elkmont parking area, where the preserved cabins from the 1920s stood among towering hemlock trees. Parked near the trailhead and stood up, clipboard in hand. "All right, folks. Everyone off for our walking tour of the historic district. We'll be exploring the Appalachian Clubhouse and several original vacation cabins." Pastor Jenkins helped Mrs. Caldwell down the steps. The family with twins gathered their backpacks and water bottles. One by one, all 17 paying passengers filed off the bus. I stayed focused on my clipboard, counting each person as they passed. 17. Good. The bus fell silent, except for the ticking of the cooling engine. I could feel the presence behind me. That wrongness made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. I kept my eyes forward, just like Dottie said. "You're new." The voice came from directly behind my seat, closer than 14B. Much closer. It sounded like wind through dry leaves, with an accent I couldn't place. Old-fashioned, maybe from the early 1900s. "Been driving these roads since 1847, the voice continued. "Seen a lot of drivers come and go. Most don't last past their first month." I gripped my clipboard tighter, knuckles white. "Don't engage. Don't turn around. Don't acknowledge. That Holcomb boy thinks his little rules will keep you safe, but rules change up here. Always have." Through my windshield, I could see my group gathering around Pastor Jenkins as he read from a historical marker about the logging industry. They looked so normal, so alive and warm in the afternoon sunlight. "You want to know why we ride along?" the voice asked. "It's lonely up here. So very lonely. And you folks from down in the valleys, you smell like home, like family, like belonging." My mouth had gone completely dry. I wanted to radio Ezra, call for help, anything. But some instinct told me that any response would be the wrong response. "Don't you worry none. I ain't staying. Not today. Got somewhere else to be." There was a pause, and I heard what sounded like fabric rustling. "Though I might see you again real soon." The temperature on the bus suddenly returned to normal. I felt the wrongness lift, like stepping out of a walking freezer into summer air. When I finally worked up the courage to check my rearview mirror, seat 14B was empty. I sat there for several minutes, just breathing and trying to process what had happened. My radio crackled. "Bus number 4, status report." Ezra's voice. "All clear," I managed. "Good. Bring them home safe." 20 minutes later, my group reboarded for the trip back to Gatlinburg. I counted them carefully. 17. Mrs. Caldwell showed me pictures she'd taken of a red salamander near one of the cabins. The twins chattered about finding arrowheads, though they'd only picked up interesting rocks. Pastor Jenkins thanked me for the educational tour. Everything seemed normal, until we reached the scenic overlook where I always made my final announcement about taking pictures. As the group filed off for one last photo opportunity, Tyler tugged on my sleeve. "Mr. Silas, why didn't that old man in the back get off at the cabins?" My stomach lurched. "What old man, buddy?" "The one with the long beard. He was sitting behind us the whole time, but he never got off the bus. Is he okay?" His mother overheard and joined us. "Tyler, honey." There wasn't anyone sitting behind us. Yes, there was. He was wearing old clothes, and he kept staring at Mr. Silas. Mason saw him too. Mason nodded vigorously. He looked sad, like he wanted to tell us something but couldn't. I knelt down to their eye level, thinking fast. Boys, sometimes the mountain light creates shadows that look like people. Your imagination fills in the details. But, tell you what, I interrupted. How about you take some extra pictures of the mountains? Sometimes cameras can show us what's really there versus what we think we see. The twins ran off with their disposable cameras, snapping photos of everything in sight. Their mother lingered, studying my face. There was someone there, wasn't there? She asked quietly. I met her eyes. "Ma'am, I've been driving these mountains for 3 years. Sometimes folks see things that don't have easy explanations, but as long as everyone gets home safe, that's what matters." She nodded slowly, then went to collect her sons. As we loaded up for the final leg back to Gatlinburg, I made my usual announcement about the pictures. The tourists obliged, their camera flashes popping like tiny lightning strikes among the trees. I watched the tree line carefully, but nothing moved in the shadows. 17 passengers loaded back onto the bus. I counted twice to be sure. But as we pulled away from the overlook, I caught something in my peripheral vision that made my blood freeze. In the last row of seats, 14B, sat a different figure than before. This one was smaller, wearing a faded floral dress that looked like it belonged to the 1950s. A woman with graying hair pulled back in a bun, her hands folded primly in her lap. She smiled at me in the rearview mirror and mouthed a single word. "Tomorrow." I understood now why Ezra needed drivers who could follow rules without asking questions, and why most of them didn't last past their first month. The bus felt crowded with 18 passengers, though only 17 were breathing. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale, knowing stares from seat 14B. By 5 a.m., I gave up, drove to Dolly's Diner on the Parkway, hoping coffee and Loretta McGee's famous biscuits might help me make sense of what was happening. Dottie was already there, hunched over a cup of black coffee in the corner booth. When she saw me, she waved me over. "Figured you'd be up early," she said, as I slid into the seat across from her. First encounter always rattles folks. "Dottie, what the hell is going on up there?" She studied my face for a long moment, then pulled out a worn spiral notebook from her purse. The cover was held together with duct tape, and the pages were filled with handwritten notes in different inks. "This here's what Ezra don't want you to know about," she said, keeping her voice low. "Real rules. Not that sanitized list he gives new drivers." I leaned forward. "Real rules?" "Honey, these mountains are old. Cherokee knew it. Early settlers learned it the hard way. Some places hold on to things that should have moved on long ago." She flipped through pages covered with dates, times, and brief descriptions. "Every driver who's lasted more than a month has contributed to this book." Loretta appeared with a coffee pot, filled my cup without being asked. She glanced at Dottie's notebook and shook her head. "Y'all still messing with that mountain business?" Loretta asked. "My grandmother always said, 'Leave sleeping dogs lie.'" "Your grandmother was Cherokee," Dottie replied. "She understood these hills better than most." After Loretta moved on to other customers, Dottie continued. "See, the thing about driving these routes is that you're not just carrying tourists. You're traveling through what Cherokee called the Nightland, places where the boundary between worlds gets thin." She pointed to an entry dated 3 weeks earlier. "Jeremiah Odom wrote this one. He drives the Cades Cove loop. Says sometimes he picks up passengers at empty bus stops that shouldn't exist." I read the cramped handwriting. Stop appeared at mile marker 7.3, old wooden bench and shelter. Woman in 1940s dress waiting with a suitcase. When I drove past without stopping, she appeared in seat 12A anyway. Rode to the Methodist church, then vanished when everyone got off for the cemetery tour. "They're not harmful exactly," Dottie explained. "More like echoes. People who died up here with strong attachments to these roads. They just want to ride along, remember what it felt like to be alive." "But that voice yesterday, it said something about rules changing." Dottie's expression darkened. "That's what worries me. The old ones, the ones who've been riding longest, they're getting stronger, more aware. Started happening about 2 years ago." She flipped to a section marked with red ink. "These are the dangerous encounters. Times when passengers didn't just want to ride, they wanted to stay." The entries in red made my skin crawl. Drivers reporting passengers who wouldn't get off at the end of routes. Tourists who began speaking in voices that weren't their own. One driver named Curtis Thorne had written, "Elderly man in seat 20D possessed Mrs. Patterson from the retirement home tour. She spoke about logging operations from 1923, used names of people who died decades ago. Took 2 hours and help from Cherokee elders to get the old logger to move on." "Jesus," I whispered. "That's why Ezra's rules exist," Dottie said. "Don't acknowledge them. Don't engage. Make sure real passengers take lots of pictures at the final stop. Light seems to remind the riders that they don't belong in our world anymore." "What happens if I can't follow the rules?" Before Dottie could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Ezra. "Emergency run today. Private charter canceled last minute. Needs you to take their group. Different route. Cataloochee Valley. Pick up at 11 a.m. Dottie saw the message and grimaced. "Cataloochee. That's Cherokee land, deeper in the park. Fewer tourists mean fewer witnesses if something goes wrong. Should I refuse? Can't. Ezra's struggling to keep drivers as it is. Just remember what I taught you. And for God's sake, don't let anyone wander off alone up there. The group waiting at the depot was smaller than usual. 8 people from a historical society in Asheville. They were researching old settlement patterns and specifically requested the remote Cataloochee route. Their leader, Dr. Margaret Cornett, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who climbed aboard with a briefcase full of documents and maps. Mr. Buchanan, we're particularly interested in the old Caldwell homestead, she said, as we pulled onto Highway 321. Our research suggests there might be undocumented graves in that area. I kept my expression neutral, but my stomach nodded. Graves meant attachments. Strong ones. The drive to Cataloochee Valley took us deep into the backcountry, following a winding road that seemed to grow narrower with each mile. Ancient trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that midday felt like dusk. Halfway up Palmer Creek Road, I noticed the temperature dropping again. My breath started forming small clouds. Frost appeared on the windshield despite the warm October weather outside. Is the air conditioning malfunctioning? Asked Dr. Cornett. Sometimes happens in these elevation changes, I lied, adjusting my rearview mirror. Seat 14B was occupied. This time it was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, wearing a simple cotton dress that looked handmade. Her dark hair was braided down her back, and her feet were bare. Unlike the previous passengers, she looked directly at the other people on the bus, with an expression of desperate longing. Dr. Cornett, she said, and I nearly swerved off the road. The Historical Society leader looked up from her documents. Yes? The graves you're looking for, the young woman continued. They're under the old oak grove behind the Caldwell cabin, but they're not marked because we died of typhoid. Families were afraid to put up stones. Dr. Cornett stared at her in confusion. I'm sorry. I don't understand. Who are you? My name is Ruth Caldwell. I died in 1892, along with my baby brother and 2 cousins. We've been waiting for someone to remember us. The other historians turned in their seats, all looking toward the back of the bus. But I could see in their faces that they weren't seeing what I was seeing. To them, the voice was coming from empty air. Mr. Buchanan, Dr. Cornett called forward, are you playing some kind of recording? This is highly inappropriate. Before I could answer, Ruth Caldwell stood up and began walking toward the front of the bus. With each step, the temperature dropped further. Ice crystals began forming on the windows. Please, she said, reaching toward Dr. Cornett. Please just acknowledge that we existed, that we mattered. Dr. Cornett recoiled as an invisible presence seemed to touch her shoulder. There's something wrong with this bus, she said, panic creeping into her voice. Stop the vehicle immediately. Ruth wasn't finished. She moved to each passenger in turn, touching them, whispering their names, telling them about her family buried in unmarked graves. The historians began shivering uncontrollably, their breath visible in the sudden Arctic air. I remembered Dottie's warning about passengers who wanted to stay. Ruth wasn't just riding along. She was trying to inhabit the living people on my bus. Following my instincts, I pulled over at the Cataloochee Visitor Center and announced, Everyone off for our tour of the historic valley. Make sure to take plenty of pictures. The historian stumbled off the bus, confused and cold. Dr. Cornett kept looking over her shoulder as if something was following her. Take pictures, I urged them. The light up here is perfect for photography. As cameras began flashing around the old homestead buildings, I felt the temperature on the bus return to normal. Ruth Caldwell flickered like a candle flame, becoming translucent. The Thank you, she whispered before fading completely. Thank you for letting me speak. But our troubles weren't over. As the historians explored the valley, photographing old barns and cabins, Dr. Cornett approached me with a disturbed expression. Mr. Buchanan, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. I nodded, though I knew whatever she'd experienced was beyond any explanation I could give. That voice on the bus, talking about typhoid victims. I've been researching this area for 15 years, and I've never found any documentation of a typhoid outbreak in the 1890s. But after hearing those details... She paused, studying my face. I'm going to check the county death records when I get back to Asheville. Sometimes these old places hold memories, I said carefully. Yes, she replied, but memories shouldn't know things that aren't in any written record. As we loaded back onto the bus for the return trip, I counted my passengers carefully. 8. All accounted for. All living and breathing. But the drive back to Gatlinburg felt different. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more aware. And every time I checked my rearview mirror, I half expected to see Ruth Caldwell again, or someone else who'd been waiting decades for acknowledgement. The mountains were waking up to our presence, and I was beginning to understand that Ezra's rules weren't just suggestions. They were the thin line between a tourist attraction and something far more dangerous. 3 days after the Catalucci incident, Dr. Cornett called the depot. Ezra took the call in his cramped office while I waited outside, picking up the frayed vinyl on the folding chair. Through the thin door, I could hear her raised voice, but not the words. When Ezra finally opened the door, his face looked like he'd aged a decade. She found them, he said quietly. Death records from 1892. Ruth Caldwell, age 19. Thomas Caldwell, age 4. Mary and Samuel Caldwell, ages 12 and 7. All died of typhoid fever within 2 weeks of each other. My mouth went dry. But that means your passenger knew details that weren't in any tourist guide or historical marker. Details that only someone who lived through it would know. Ezra sank into his desk chair, rubbing his temples. Dr. Cornett is asking questions. Lots of them. What did you tell her? Same thing I tell everyone who gets too curious. Mountain folklore, local legends, coincidence. He looked up at me with tired eyes. But she's not buying it. Says she's bringing a paranormal investigation team up here next week. The radio on Ezra's desk crackled to life. Depot, this is bus number 2. Got a situation out here. Ezra grabbed the handset. Go ahead, Willie. Willie Hemsley's voice came through scratchy and strained. I'm at Cades Cove. Got a group of college kids from UT. They're saying someone's been following the bus on foot for the past 5 miles, walking alongside us, keeping pace at 30 miles per hour. I felt that familiar cold knot in my stomach. Ezra and I exchanged glances. How many passengers reporting this? Ezra asked. All 12 of them. Here's the thing. I can see him too. The radio went silent. Ezra's knuckles were white where he gripped the handset. Willie, you copy? Yeah, I'm here. But Ezra, this ain't like the usual riders. This one's different. He's not trying to get on the bus. He's hurting us, pushing us toward something. Toward what? The old cemetery behind the Methodist church. Every time I try to take a different route, he appears ahead of us, arms spread wide, forcing me to turn toward the cemetery. Ezra stood up, pacing the small office. Willie, listen to me. Do not stop at that cemetery. Keep driving. Take the loop road back to the visitor center. I tried. Road's blocked. Tree fell across it about 10 minutes ago, right after this fella showed up. I grabbed Ezra's arm. Send me out there. Willie needs backup. Absolutely not. You're still learning. Dottie's on the Gatlinburg route. Won't be back for 3 hours. Willie can't handle this alone with a bus full of college kids. Ezra stared at me for a long moment, then tossed me the keys to bus number 1. Take the emergency kit from the supply room. Silas, if things go sideways, you get those kids out of there, even if it means abandoning Willie. The emergency kit turned out to be a canvas bag containing road flares, a first aid kit, 2 digital cameras, and something I didn't expect. A leather pouch filled with what looked like white sand mixed with small stones. Cherokee Blessing sand, Ezra explained when he saw my confusion. Old Charlie Swimmer made it for us years ago. His grandmother taught him the ritual. Sprinkle it in a circle around anything you want protected. I drove toward Cades Cove faster than the speed limit allowed, my radio tuned to Willie's frequency. Every few minutes, he'd check in with updates that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. Still pushing us toward the cemetery. College kids are getting spooked. One girl's crying, says the man outside looks like her dead grandfather. This is getting worse. He's not alone anymore. I count at least 6 figures walking alongside us now. Ezra, you there? We're at the cemetery gates. I can't drive past. There's more of them blocking the road ahead. When I reached Cades Cove, I found Willie's bus parked at the entrance to the old Methodist cemetery. Through his windshield, I could see him hunched over the steering wheel, radio in hand. College students were pressed against the windows on one side of the bus, staring at something I couldn't see. I parked behind him, grabbed the emergency kit. The moment I stepped outside, the temperature plummeted. October in Tennessee doesn't feel like January, but the air around the cemetery carried winter's bite. Then I saw them. 7 figures stood in a loose semicircle around Willie's bus. Men and women in clothes from different eras. 1800s farming clothes, 1940s military uniform, 1960s sundress. They weren't threatening exactly, but their positioning was deliberate, purposeful. The figure Willie had described stood closest to the cemetery gates. He was tall and gaunt, wearing a black suit that looked like it belonged to a funeral director from the early 1900s. When he turned toward me, I saw eyes that held too much knowledge, too much sorrow. "You're the new driver," he said, his voice carrying across the space between us, despite speaking at normal volume. The one who let Ruth speak. I remembered Dottie's advice about not engaging, but these weren't passengers anymore. They were something else, something that required different rules. "What do you want?" I asked. "Recognition. Remembrance. The same thing Ruth wanted." He gestured toward the cemetery. "There are stories buried here that need telling. Deaths that were covered up. Crimes that were forgotten. I can't help with that. But you can. You and your passengers, with your cameras and your curiosity. You can make people remember." On Willie's bus, the college students were becoming agitated. I could hear raised voices, someone pounding on the windows. One boy tried to open the emergency exit, but Willie shouted something that made him stop. "You need to let them leave," he said. The figure in black smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen. "Not until someone listens. Not until someone cares enough to uncover the truth." That's when I understood. These weren't random spirits looking for peace. They were organizing, coordinating, using the tour buses as leverage to force people to pay attention to their forgotten stories. I opened the emergency kit and pulled out the leather pouch. Blessing sand felt warm in my hands, almost alive. Following instinct more than any plan, I began walking toward Willie's bus, sprinkling the sand in a wide circle. The effect was immediate. The figures began backing away from the circle, their forms becoming translucent. The man in black held his ground. "You think Cherokee magic will solve this?" he asked. "This land remembers everything, boy. Every injustice, every cover-up, every convenient lie. We're just the beginning." "Maybe so," I said, completing the circle around both buses. "But right now, I've got living people to protect." The man in black nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But this isn't over. More drivers will come. More passengers will see us. And eventually someone will listen." He began to fade, along with the other figures. As they disappeared, the fallen tree blocking the loop road simply wasn't there anymore. Willie opened his bus door and climbed down on shaking legs. "How did you—" "Questions later," I said. "Get your group back to the visitor center. Now." As both buses pulled away from the cemetery, I radioed Ezra. "Situation resolved. Willie's group is safe." "Copy that. Both of you get back here. We need to talk." But as I drove the winding road back toward Gatlinburg, I kept checking my mirrors. Not for supernatural passengers this time, but for something worse. Black vehicles that might belong to Dr. Cornett's paranormal investigation team. The spirits were getting organized and demanding recognition. That was problem enough. But if outside investigators started documenting what happened on these mountain roads, it would bring attention from people with resources and technology we couldn't control. People who might not follow Ezra's rules about keeping quiet. People who might turn our contained situation into something that could spread beyond the mountains entirely. The paranormal investigation team arrived on a Thursday morning in 3 black SUVs that looked more like federal vehicles than tourist rentals. Dr. Cornett led them into Ezra's office, while I pretended to check tire pressure on bus number 4, straining to hear their conversation through the thin walls. "Mr. Holcomb, I need you to understand the significance of what we documented," Dr. Cornett was saying. "Voice recordings that contain historical details not found in any written record. Temperature fluctuations that register on our equipment. This isn't folklore anymore." Ezra's response was too quiet for me to make out, but Dr. Cornett's reply came through clearly. "We're not here to shut you down. We want to study this phenomenon properly, with your cooperation." Dottie pulled into the depot and parked next to me. She studied the SUVs with a grim expression. "Well, hell," she muttered. "Knew this day would come eventually." "What do? We keep doing our jobs and hope those city folks don't stir up something they can't handle." She grabbed her thermos from the front seat. "But Silas, honey, you need to know something. These investigators think they're dealing with ordinary ghosts. They ain't prepared for what lives in the deep hollers." "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, Ezra emerged from his office with Dr. Cornett and 3 people I didn't recognize. One was a middle-aged man carrying electronic equipment. Another was a young woman with multiple cameras hanging around her neck. The third was an older woman who kept scanning the tree line like she expected something to emerge. "Silas," Ezra called. "Come here. These folks want to ride along on your afternoon route." My stomach dropped, but I forced a neutral expression. "Which route?" "Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail," Dr. Cornett said. "We're particularly interested in the area around the old Ogle homestead." I knew that area. It was where Jeremiah Odom had reported seeing entire families of spirits walking alongside his bus, dressed in clothes from the 1800s. If these investigators wanted to document paranormal activity, Roaring Fork would give them more than they bargained for. The equipment specialist, who introduced himself as Marcus Torres, began setting up devices on the bus while explaining their purpose. Electromagnetic field detectors, digital thermometers, infrared cameras. If there's any anomalous activity, we'll record it. The photographer, Sarah Kim, positioned cameras throughout the interior. Dr. Cornett described voice phenomena and temperature changes. These will capture everything. The older woman, Dr. Elena Vasquez, sat in the front seat and pulled out what looked like a modified tablet. I'm monitoring real-time environmental data. Any deviation from baseline readings will trigger alerts. My regular afternoon group consisted of 6 retirees from a Florida RV park, led by a cheerful woman named Betty Morrison. They were delighted to be part of a scientific study, treating it like an added attraction, rather than the dangerous experiment it actually was. We pulled out of the depot at 1:30 p.m., heading toward the Roaring Fork entrance. I tried to follow my normal routine, pointing out landmarks and sharing historical anecdotes, but my attention kept drifting to the investigators' equipment. As we enter the motor trail, you'll notice we're following an old logging road, I announced. This area was heavily timbered in the early 1900s, and several families homesteaded here before the park was established. Dr. Vasquez's tablet began beeping softly. Electromagnetic readings are elevated, she reported. Temperature is dropping despite the afternoon sun. We hadn't even reached the first historic cabin, and already the mountain was responding to our presence. Marcus's equipment started registering activity around the Alfred Reagan homestead. The EMF detectors squealed, and Sarah's cameras began clicking automatically, triggered by motion sensors. There, Betty Morrison pointed toward the old cabin. I see someone by the front porch. I looked where she was pointing and saw a man in overalls and a wide-brimmed hat, standing motionless beside the cabin's stone chimney. He was staring directly at our bus with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Getting clear visual contact, Sarah whispered, adjusting her telephoto lens. Male figure, period clothing, standing in full sunlight but casting no shadow. The man began walking toward the road, and I realized with growing horror that he wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the cabin, a woman in a faded dress, 3 children of various ages, an elderly man leaning on a walking stick. My God, Dr. Cornett breathed. It's an entire family. Dr. Vasquez's tablet was beeping frantically now. Temperature down 15 degrees and falling. EMF readings are off the charts. The family reached the edge of the road and began walking alongside the bus, keeping perfect pace despite our 15-mile-per-hour speed. The children waved at the passengers, their faces bright with joy, while the adults maintained that same unsettling stare. They look so real, one of the Florida retirees said. Are they park employees in costume? Before I could deflect the question, the eldest child, a girl around 10 years old, spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Mama says to tell you the fever took us all in 1918. We've been waiting for visitors to come see the homestead. Sarah's cameras were capturing everything, flashes triggering rapidly. But instead of driving the spirits away like they normally did, the light seemed to make them more solid, more present. This is remarkable, Dr. Cornett said, scribbling notes. Direct communication, historical context, multiple witnesses. That's when I realized the fundamental mistake these investigators were making. They thought documentation would help them understand the phenomenon. Instead, their attention was feeding it, making it stronger. The family walked with us for another quarter-mile before fading back into the forest. But as we approached the next homestead, the Noah Ogle cabin, new figures appeared. More families, more children, more voices calling out dates and names and forgotten stories. By the time we reached the Ephraim Bales cabin, my bus was surrounded by at least 20 spirits. They pressed close to the windows, their faces eager and desperate. The investigators' equipment was registering so much activity that Marcus had to turn down the audio alerts to prevent feedback loops. The mill wheel, an old woman's voice said from somewhere behind my left shoulder. Look at the mill wheel. I glanced toward the historic gristmill and felt my blood freeze. The wooden wheel was turning, grinding grain that wasn't there, operated by a miller who'd been dead for over a century. "Are you getting this?" Dr. Cornett asked Sarah. "Every second of it. But the strange thing is some of them aren't showing up on the infrared cameras, only visible light spectrum." "What does that mean?" Dr. Vasquez looked up from her tablet with a troubled expression. "It means we're dealing with different types of manifestations. Some are residual energy, like recordings, but others—" She paused, studying her readings. "Others are interactive, intelligent, and getting stronger with our attention. That's when one of the spirits did something I'd never seen before." A young man in a Confederate soldier's uniform didn't just walk alongside the bus. He climbed onto it. I watched in the rearview mirror as he pulled himself up the back ladder and began walking across the roof. The metal groaned under his weight, creating footsteps that everyone could hear. "Someone's on top of the bus," Betty Morrison said, looking up at the ceiling. Marcus aimed his equipment upward. Concentrated mass displacement directly above us. Something with significant weight. The soldier moved toward the front of the bus, his boots echoing with each step. When he reached the area above my seat, he knelt down and spoke through the roof in a voice that seemed to come from inside my own head. "Driver, you need to turn around. Now don't go to the end of the trail." "Why?" I asked quietly, hoping the passengers wouldn't notice me talking to empty air. "Because something's waiting there that ain't like us. Something that's been feeding on all this attention you're bringing. Something that's been growing stronger each time your buses come through." Dr. Cornett leaned forward. "Did you say something?" Before I could answer, every piece of electronic equipment on the bus went dead simultaneously. The engine kept running, but all the investigators' devices shut down without warning. "What just happened?" Sarah asked, frantically checking her cameras. "EMP-like interference," Marcus said, "but that's not possible from a natural phenomenon." The soldier on the roof spoke again. "Turn around, driver. Please. What's at the end of this trail ain't something your passengers should see." But it was too late. We'd already reached the final stop. The parking area where the trail ends had a small waterfall. And standing beside the falls was something that made every spirit we'd encountered seem harmless by comparison. It looked human at first glance, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at angles that human joints couldn't achieve. Its face was a shifting blur of features that never quite settled into a stable configuration. "My equipment," Dr. Vasquez whispered. "It's working again. But the readings... This is impossible." The thing by the waterfall turned toward our bus, and I felt a wave of hunger so intense it made me nauseous. Not hunger for food, but for attention, for acknowledgement, for the kind of focused observation that the investigators had been providing all afternoon. Every spirit on the trail had been drawn here by our activities, feeding this larger entity with their increased manifestations. And now it was strong enough to affect the physical world directly. The Florida retirees were pressing against the windows, trying to get a better look. "Is that part of the show?" Betty Morrison asked. "Everyone stay in your seats," I announced, trying to keep panic out of my voice. "We're turning around now." But when I shifted into reverse, the engine died. The thing by the waterfall raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at our bus. Dr. Cornett's scientific objectivity finally cracked. "What is that thing?" The Confederate soldier on the roof answered her. "That's what happens when too many folks pay attention to things that should stay hidden. Y'all have been feeding it for months with your cameras and questions and recordings." Every window on the bus began fogging over from the inside, despite the mild October temperature. In the condensation, words began appearing, not written by any human hand. "Stay, witness, Remember, the entity by the waterfall started walking toward us. The entity moved with a fluidity that hurt to watch, flowing across the ground like spilled mercury. With each step closer to our bus, the windows fogged thicker, and the temperature dropped until our breath came in visible puffs. Everyone moved to the center aisle, I ordered, remembering the emergency kit under my seat. Stay away from the windows. Dr. Cornett was frantically trying to restart her tablet. The electromagnetic readings are beyond anything in the literature. This entity is generating energy signatures equivalent to a small power plant. Science ain't gonna help you now, lady, the Confederate soldier said from the roof, his voice carrying through the metal like it was paper. That thing down there has been feeding on curiosity for months. Every camera flash, every recording device, every attempt to study these mountains has made it stronger. Betty Morrison grabbed my arm as the entity reached the front of the bus. What does it want? Through the fogged windshield, I could see the creature examining our vehicle like a child studying an interesting insect. Its face kept shifting. Sometimes human features, sometimes animal, sometimes combinations that shouldn't exist. It wants to be seen, I said, pulling the leather pouch of Cherokee Blessing sand from the emergency kit. But not just seen. Understood. Documented. Studied. It feeds on human attention, scientific analysis. The thing pressed what might have been a hand against the windshield. Where it touched, the glass began turning black, spreading outward like ink in water. Sand, Dr. Vasquez whispered, staring at the pouch in my hands. That's not standard emergency equipment. No, it's not. I opened the pouch, feeling the warmth of the blessed materials against my palm. My boss learned the hard way that these mountains require older protections than GPS and first aid kits. Marcus was still trying to get his equipment functioning. If we could just document the energy patterns. Stop, I said sharply. That's exactly what it wants. Every time you try to measure it, record it, or analyze it, you're feeding it. Sarah lowered her cameras with visible reluctance. But this is the discovery of the century. We can't just ignore. You can and you will, unless you want to become part of what's being discovered. Confederate soldier's boots echoed above us as he moved toward the rear of the bus. Driver's right, miss. I seen what happens to folks who study too hard up here. They start seeing things that ain't just mountain spirits, things that ain't never been human at all. The entity had finished blackening the windshield and was now moving along the side of the bus, touching each window in turn. Where its appendages made contact, the glass went dark, cutting off our view of the outside world. We're being sealed in, Dr. Cornett observed with scientific detachment that was either admirable or terrifying. Not sealed, the soldier corrected. Preserved, like specimens in a jar. That's when I understood what we were dealing with. This wasn't just some hungry spirit or angry ghost. It was something that collected things. Experiences, knowledge, people who ventured too deep into its territory. How long has it been here? I asked the soldier. Long as I can remember, and I've been dead since 1863. Cherokee knew about it, tried to keep folks away from this particular hollow. But white settlers, they don't listen to warnings about old things in the woods. The bus began rocking gently, as if something large was testing its weight distribution. Through the last unblackened window, I glimpsed multiple appendages wrapping around the vehicle's undercarriage. It's lifting us, Dr. Vasquez said, watching her tablet's accelerometer readings. Elevation increasing at a steady rate. Betty Morrison let out a small cry as we felt the bus leave the ground entirely. The elderly woman next to her began praying in Spanish, her words mixing with the sound of metal creaking under strain. I stood up, holding the blessing sand. Everyone join hands. Form a circle in the center aisle. This is hardly the time for... Dr. Cornett began. Do it, I said firmly. The sand works through connection, through shared intention. Right now, we need to become something it can't easily study or categorize. Reluctantly, the investigators linked hands with the Florida retirees. I moved to the center of their circle, opened the pouch, and began sprinkling the sand around our feet. The effect was immediate. The bus stopped rising and began swaying, as if whatever was carrying us had suddenly found us difficult to grip. What's happening? Sarah asked. Cherokee blessings sand creates spiritual camouflage, I explained, continuing to spread the protective circle. It makes you invisible to things that hunt by sensing human curiosity or fear. The creature dropped us back onto the parking lot with a crash that threw everyone to the floor. When we struggled back to our feet, the windows began clearing, black substance dissolving like smoke. Through the windshield, I could see the entity standing 20 feet away, its form wavering between different configurations. It seemed confused, turning its head-like appendage in different directions, as if searching for something it had lost. Is it gone? Betty Morrison whispered. Not gone, Confederate soldier said. Just can't see you clear enough to grab hold of anymore. But that protection won't last long if you keep feeding it attention. Dr. Cornett was staring at the creature with obvious fascination. The energy readings are dropping rapidly. Whatever you did, it's affecting the entity's ability to maintain coherence. Dr. Cornett, I said carefully, I need you to stop analyzing it. Right now. Every observation you make strengthens the connection between you and it. But I could see the struggle in her face. For a researcher, being told to ignore the greatest discovery of her career was like asking a drowning person not to reach for a life preserver. Marcus was already reaching for his recording equipment. Just basic documentation. No, I moved between him and his gear. Nothing. No recordings, no measurements, no photographs. We walk away from this like it never happened. You can't be serious. Look at it, I said, pointing through the windshield. The entity was beginning to solidify again, its form becoming more defined as the investigators' scientific curiosity overcame their fear. It sensed their renewed attention and started moving toward the bus once more. Every second you spend thinking about it as a research subject makes it stronger, I continued. You want to survive this? Stop being scientists for the next 10 minutes. The bus engine suddenly roared to life on its own. Through the roof, the Confederate soldier called down. Now would be a good time to leave, driver. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the bus into reverse and backed away from the waterfall as quickly as the narrow trail allowed. In my mirrors, I watched the entity grow smaller and less distinct as we increased the distance. Will it follow us? Dr. Vasquez asked. Not off its home territory, the soldier replied. But it knows you now, knows your scent, your curiosity patterns. You come back to these mountains, it'll be waiting. As we navigated the winding road back toward the main highway, I noticed that the other spirits, the families and individuals we'd encountered earlier, were gone. The attention they'd been receiving had been redirected to the entity, and without that energy, they'd faded back to whatever realm they usually inhabited. So what do we do with what we've learned? Dr. Cornett asked quietly. Nothing, I said. You go back to Asheville. You write up a report that says the local folklore was interesting, but unsubstantiated. You never mention what really happened here. But the scientific implications... The scientific implications, I interrupted, are that some things shouldn't be studied. Some knowledge comes with a price that's too high to pay. Marcus was staring at his dead equipment. All of our data is corrupted anyway. The electromagnetic interference wiped everything. Good, I said, and I meant it. By the time we reached the depot, the afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. The investigators gathered their useless equipment and loaded it into their SUVs without much conversation. The excitement they'd shown that morning was gone, replaced by a subdued awareness that they'd encountered something beyond their ability to categorize or control. Dr. Cornett approached me as I was locking up the bus. "Mr. Buchanan, I want you to know that we're not going to publish anything about today's experience." Smart choice. But I have to ask, how long has this been going on? How many drivers have faced what we face today? I looked up at the darkening peaks, where lights were beginning to twinkle in the valley below. Normal lights, from normal homes, where normal people were making dinner and helping kids with homework and living lives that didn't involve entities that fed on human curiosity. Long enough, I said. Hopefully, not much longer. As the investigators drove away, their taillights disappearing down River Road, I realized that our real problems were just beginning. The entity might be confined to Roaring Fork for now. It was stronger than ever. And eventually, other researchers would come. Other people who thought they could study the supernatural without consequences. The mountains were waking up, and we were running out of ways to keep them quiet. 2 weeks after the investigators left, everything went to hell. It started with Willie's radio call at 6:23 a.m. His voice cracked with panic. "Depot, we got a problem at the Cherokee Reservation overlook. Big problem." Ezra and I were sharing coffee and going over route schedules when the transmission came through. I was supposed to be off duty. Something in Willie's tone made me grab my keys. "What kind of problem?" Ezra asked into the handset. "The kind where my passengers are seeing things that ain't on any tour map. And Ezra, they're not staying in the bus anymore." I felt my stomach drop. The entity at Roaring Fork was supposed to be contained to its own territory, but if it had grown strong enough to extend its influence... "Willie, where are your passengers now?" "That's just it. I don't know. They got off the bus about 10 minutes ago to take pictures at the overlook. Now they're walking toward the woods like they're in some kind of trance. I can't get them to respond when I call their names." Ezra and I exchanged looks. This was beyond anything we'd dealt with before. "Hold your position," Ezra radioed. "Silas is en route with emergency supplies." I grabbed the canvas bag containing the remaining Cherokee blessing sand and drove toward the reservation as fast as I dared on the mountain roads. The overlook Willie mentioned was at the boundary between Parkland and Cherokee territory, a place where old agreements and older protections sometimes overlapped in complicated ways. When I arrived, Willie was standing beside his empty bus, staring helplessly into the forest. "They went that way." He pointed toward a trail that led deeper into the reservation, walking like they had somewhere important to be. "How many?" 14. Family reunion group from Knoxville. Been looking forward to this trip for months. Willie's hand shook as he lit a cigarette. "Silas, there's something else." Before they wandered off, they all started talking in unison. Same words, same tone, like they were reading from a script. What did they say? "The old agreements are breaking. The boundaries don't hold anymore. Come and see what's been waiting." That's when I knew we were facing something beyond the entity at Roaring Fork. The Cherokee had treaties with things that lived in these mountains, agreements that went back centuries, designed to keep certain powers contained to specific territories. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number Dottie had given me weeks earlier. "For emergencies only," she'd said. "When white man's rules stop working." Charlie Swimmer answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call." "Mr. Swimmer, we need help. Something's taken 14 tourists into the woods near the reservation overlook." "I know. My grandmother's been expecting this. The entity you folks stirred up at Roaring Fork has been calling to its kin, trying to break the old boundaries. There was a pause. How much Cherokee Blessing sand you got left? I checked the pouch. Maybe enough for one more protection circle. Won't be sufficient. You're gonna need something stronger. Meet me at the old trading post on Highway 441. Bring that other driver with you. The trading post turned out to be a weathered building I'd driven past hundreds of times without noticing. Charlie Swimmer was waiting in the parking lot. A man in his 70s with silver braids and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Your tourists aren't just lost, he said without preamble. They're being recruited. The entity wants to use them as anchors to establish itself in new territory. Anchors for what? To break through into our world permanently. Right now, it needs human attention to maintain coherence. But if it can possess enough people, make them into permanent observers, it won't need to hide in remote hollows anymore. Willie dropped his cigarette. You mean it could spread beyond the mountains? First the reservation, then Gatlinburg, then anywhere those folks might travel when they go home. If they go home. Charlie opened a leather satchel and pulled out items I didn't recognize. Carved stones, dried plants, what looked like small animal bones. Traditional protections. But we'll need to work together, Cherokee and White, to make them effective. He handed me a piece of carved jade that felt warm to the touch. This will help you see through any illusions the entity creates. But more important, it'll help you resist the urge to study what you're seeing. What about getting the tourists back? That's the dangerous part. We'll have to follow them into the entity's expanded territory and convince them to return willingly. Force won't work. They have to choose to break the connection themselves. The trail into the forest was well marked initially, but after half a mile, it began branching in directions that didn't appear on any park map. Charlie led us along paths that seemed to exist only when he was looking at them, through groves where the trees grew in configurations that hurt to contemplate directly. Don't try to understand the geography, he warned. This is spirit territory now. Physical laws are suggestions, not requirements. We found the tourists gathered in a clearing that definitely hadn't existed on any survey map. All 14 of them stood in a perfect circle around something that made the entity at Roaring Fork look harmless by comparison. It was vast, easily 20 feet tall, with a form that shifted between organic and geometric shapes. But unlike the creature we'd encountered before, this one was clearly in communication with its human observers. They were having a conversation, though the words reached us as a low humming that seemed to bypass our ears entirely. The old woman in the blue dress, Willie whispered. That's Margaret Hemley. She's 83 years old and has arthritis so bad she can barely walk. But look at her. Margaret was moving with fluid grace, dancing around the entity with the other tourists. All of them appeared decades younger, their faces bright with joy and wonder. It's showing them what they want to see, Charlie said, promising them health, knowledge, experiences beyond anything their normal lives could offer. How do we counter that? With truth. Hard, ugly truth about what accepting those gifts will cost. Charlie pulled out a handful of the carved stones. These will let them see what they're really bargaining with. He began throwing the stones in a wide arc around the clearing. Where each one landed, the air shimmered like heat waves. And suddenly, the tourists' expressions changed from joy to confusion. The entity's true form became visible. Not the appealing shapes it had been projecting, but something composed of hungry emptiness, void spaces that pulled at reality itself. The tourists stumbled backward, their borrowed youth fading as the illusion broke. Margaret, Willie called. This way. Follow my voice. Some of the tourists began moving toward us, but others seemed frozen, caught between competing realities. The entity was fighting back, wrapping tendrils of distorted space around those it didn't want to lose. That's when I understood what Charlie meant about willing choice. The entity couldn't force anyone to stay. It could make leaving seem impossible, undesirable, or simply unthinkable. I pulled out the jade stone Charlie had given me and stepped into the clearing. Mrs. Henley, your grandchildren are waiting for you back in Knoxville. Your daughter Sarah is worried sick. The personal connection worked. Margaret's eyes focused on me, recognition cutting through the entity's influence. How do you know about Sarah? Because I'm real. This place isn't. This thing is showing you what you want to see, but it's not offering to give it to you. It's offering to let you dream about having it, while it feeds on your attention forever. One by one, the tourists began choosing reality over illusion. The entity's form became less stable as its human anchors broke free, till finally it collapsed into itself and vanished, leaving only a circle of disturbed earth where it had stood. The walk back to our vehicles took twice as long as the journey in, partly because the spirit paths kept shifting, but mostly because the tourists were exhausted from their ordeal. Most of them remembered very little, just feeling drawn to explore the forest, and then finding themselves lost until we arrived. Will it be back? Willie asked as we reached the parking area. Charlie packed his remaining tools carefully. Not here, not for a while. But breaking the old boundaries has consequences. Other entities will test the weakened spots, see what they can get away with. So this isn't over. Son, this kind of thing is never over. It just goes quiet for a while, lets people forget, then tries again. He looked at both of us seriously. You boys need to understand. Your job isn't to defeat these things. It's to maintain the balance, keep them contained, and make sure folks like those investigators don't stir up more than they can handle. As the tourists reboarded Willie's bus, chattering about their hiking adventure, and already revising the experience into something explainable, I realized Charlie was right. We weren't exterminators or heroes. We were maintenance workers, keeping ancient problems from becoming modern disasters. But as we drove back toward town, I couldn't shake the feeling that our maintenance contract was about to get a lot more complicated. I still drive for Blue Ridge Mountain Tours, though my routes have changed. Ezra moved me to the safer circuits. Dollywood shuttle runs, downtown Gatlinburg loops, trips that stay well clear of the old territories. Willie quit after the reservation incident, moved back to Mississippi to help run his brother's catfish farm. Can't say I blame him. Dottie retired her notebook to Charlie Swimmer, who promised the Cherokee elders would add it to their own records. Your people and mine, we got different ways of remembering, he told me when he stopped by the depot last week. The mountains don't care about our differences. They just want someone paying attention to the old agreements. I keep a piece of his carved jade in my shirt pocket now, next to my CDL and emergency contact card. Some mornings, when the fog sits heavy in the valleys, I feel it warming against my chest. A reminder that the work we do up here isn't just about entertaining tourists. Dr. Cornett never published her research. She sends me Christmas cards now. Always the same message. Thank you for reminding me that some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious. Her investigation team disbanded quietly. Marcus Torres went back to studying conventional electromagnetic phenomena. Sarah Kim switched to wedding photography. Dr. Vasquez took a teaching position at a small college in Montana, far from any mountains with complicated histories. The new drivers Ezra hired don't get the full truth right away, just the basic rules, the safe routes, and careful observation of how they handle minor oddities. Last month, a kid named Trevor Blackwood started asking the right questions after passengers on his Cades Cove run reported seeing folks in period clothing near the old cabins. I shared Dottie's sanitized version of the notebook with him, watched him process the information with the kind of steady acceptance that suggests he might last. Tourism in the Smokies continues as it always has. Families come to see waterfalls and black bears. Couples take romantic drives through autumn foliage. Church groups explore historical cabins and learn about mountain heritage. Most leave with nothing more unusual than too many photographs and overpriced souvenirs. But sometimes, on the remote routes where cell phone signals fade, the trees grow too close to the road, passengers report things that don't fit the standard park experience. A child waving from an empty cabin window. An elderly man walking impossibly fast through dense underbrush. Voices calling from the forest in languages that sound almost familiar. When those reports come in, I radio Charlie Swimmer's grandson, who works for the tribal police now. Between his people's knowledge and what we've learned from years of bus routes through haunted territory, we usually manage to keep situations contained. The entity from Roaring Fork hasn't been seen since our confrontation, but Charlie says that doesn't mean it's gone. Things like that don't die, he explained. They just wait for conditions to improve. Different researchers, different kind of attention, different opportunity to break through. He's probably right. Every few months, someone contacts the depot asking about paranormal activity in the area. Graduate students writing theses on Appalachian folklore. Documentary filmmakers looking for authentic ghost stories. Social media influencers hoping to capture something viral from the mountains. Ezra refers them all to the standard tourist information, tells them about Cherokee legends and early settler stories, gives them enough conventional material to satisfy their curiosity without pointing them toward anything genuinely dangerous. At night, when I drive the empty roads back to my apartment in Gatlinburg, I sometimes catch movement in my peripheral vision. Figures standing just outside the headlight beams, watching the buses come and go, waiting for their chance to ride along with the living again. I don't acknowledge them anymore. Don't engage or investigate or try to understand what they want. I just drive my route, follow the rules, and trust that someone else is maintaining whatever boundaries keep the mountains from remembering too much about the things that should stay forgotten.